This story is for you. If you've ever felt like you were losing yourself in a relationship, trapped in someone else's idea of who you should be, this is for you. I was never the type of woman who believed in fairy tales. I had seen enough of life's cruel twists to know that love wasn't supposed to be the kind of thing you see in books or movies. But then, I met Daniel. And for the first time, I thought maybe the world was wrong. Maybe I had been living life with the wrong set of expectations. Maybe this was real. When we met, it felt like the universe had finally aligned. He was everything I hadn't known I was looking for. I had always been lost in the pages of novels, in the soft rustle of paper and ink that held entire worlds, whole lives, in a single turn of a page. Daniel was different. He wasn't just the charming, confident man that swept through my life like a storm. He was everything I thought I had been waiting for. His eyes, those piercing blue eyes, were enough to draw you in and make you feel like you mattered, like your voice could reach the heavens just by being heard by him. I had spent my years teaching literature at a small college, wrapped up in stories of heartbreak and love that would never be mine. But with Daniel, I thought I had found the real thing. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to be vulnerable, to trust, to believe that maybe there was more to this life than just words on paper. He listened to me in a way no one else ever did. He made me feel like I was the most important person in the room. In the beginning, everything was perfect. He paid attention to every little detail, things no one else would notice. The way my hair fell over my shoulders, the way I liked my coffee, the books I was reading. He knew me better than anyone. Or at least, that's what I thought. But over time, something shifted. Subtle, almost imperceptible changes at first. A sharp comment here, a slight look there, a suggestion that I was somehow too much. At first, I didn't notice, or maybe I didn't want to. Maybe I was just too in love, too caught up in the whirlwind of his attention, too flattered by the way he seemed to want to protect me from everything. I remember the first time I felt it, the first real crack in the image he had painted for me. It was a simple thing. Something that now seems so small, but at the time it felt like the world was shifting beneath me. We were out shopping for a new dress for a faculty dinner. I had chosen something simple, nothing too flashy, just a soft blue dress that made me feel comfortable in my skin. It wasn't too revealing, nothing daring, just a piece of clothing that made me feel confident in my own way. I had always thought that was the point of dressing up, to feel like yourself, to feel beautiful for who you are. But when I showed Daniel, he didn't smile the way I thought he would. Instead, his lips pressed into a thin line, and he took a step closer, his eyes scanning the fabric like it was something he needed to dissect. "That dress is too distracting for your students," he said, his voice calm but firm, like he was doing me a favor. At first, I laughed it off. "It's just a dress, Daniel." But he wasn't laughing. His eyes hardened, just for a second, before the mask of charm slid back on. "Trust me, Elena, you don't want to give them the wrong impression." I should have felt angry. I should have yelled at him, told him that I was a grown woman and that I could dress however I wanted. But instead, I felt this strange, suffocating pressure in my chest. My heart hammered as I tried to process his words. What had I done wrong? The dress was nothing special, so why did it suddenly feel like a reflection of my worth was tied to it? Why did his words make me question my choices, my body, my entire sense of self? I didn't protest. Instead, I stood there in silence, holding the dress in my hands, unsure of how to feel. I tried to shrug it off, but the doubt settled in. He was just trying to protect me, I thought. After all, he loved me. He wanted what was best for me, right? That's what he kept saying. I convinced myself that his concern was genuine, that maybe I was just being too sensitive, too dramatic, like he often told me. But as the days went on, it wasn't just the dress, it was everything. The way he critiqued my work, my job, the way I managed my life. I began to see his care in a new light, not as love, but as control. It wasn't enough that he loved me. He needed to own me. He wanted to shape me, mold me into someone who could fit the life he had already mapped out. I remember one argument in particular. He had taken over the finances in our relationship, insisting that I wasn't capable of managing money. "You're too naive," he said one evening, his words cutting through the air like a knife. "Let me handle it. You focus on your little books and leave the real-world stuff to me." And just like that, I was reduced to a little professor, a woman with no understanding of the things that truly mattered. His words stung, and for a moment, I felt that familiar weight of inadequacy press down on me. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even upset. He was calm. Too calm. But in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't about him caring for me. This was about him reshaping me, making me doubt my own abilities, my own worth. I started to notice the cracks, the tiny shifts that I had once dismissed as harmless. It wasn't just his words anymore. It was the way he looked at me when I made decisions, the way he smiled when I doubted myself. It was in the subtle ways he pulled me away from my friends, isolated me from the people who truly knew me. Its charm had a way of making everything feel justified, making me believe that everything was for my own good, that I was too weak to understand the world without his guidance. I hated myself for it. I hated the way I let him convince me I was less than I was, the way I let myself become smaller, quieter, less of the woman I used to be. The worst part was that I didn't even realize it at first. The fight between who I was and who he wanted me to be was an invisible war, one I didn't know how to fight. And so I stayed silent, I stayed quiet because I was scared of the alternative, of facing him, of confronting the truth that he was suffocating me. When did it stop being about us and start being about what you thought was best for me? I would ask myself that over and over in the quiet moments when I was alone, wondering how I had gotten here. I thought I was in control, but I wasn't. Not anymore. And yet, I stayed. Because love, I thought, was supposed to be unconditional, even when it started to feel like a cage, even when his love started to feel like a trap. But I was wrong. I wasn't weak. I wasn't the person he made me think I was, and one day I would find the strength to prove it. But at that moment, all I had was the whisper of a thought that maybe, just maybe, I deserved better. The truth is, when you're in a relationship like mine, the cracks don't appear all at once. They're subtle, tiny at first, so small that you barely notice them, and then one day, they're all you can see. The worst part, you don't even know how they got there. You've been told over and over that they're not really cracks, that you're just imagining things. I wish I could say I woke up one morning and saw the full extent of the damage Daniel had done, but no, the real awakening came slowly, quietly, like the creeping fog that you don't notice until it's already consumed the landscape. At first, it was the little things, the comments, the criticisms, the kind of things that, in isolation, don't seem like much, but when they add up, they carve away at the person you used to be. Daniel began to criticize my work, my passion, my career. I had always believed in the power of literature, in the beauty of storytelling, in the strength of my students. But to him, it was all naive. "You're too idealistic, Elena," he would say, his tone dripping with condescension. "This isn't a fairy tale. You need to face reality." Each word stung in ways I couldn't explain. I was a literature professor, for heaven's sake. I had spent my entire life studying the complexities of human emotion, of stories that shaped the world. But to Daniel, it wasn't enough. "People don't care about what you're teaching," he'd scoff. "They care about what they can use. Why aren't you focusing on something that matters? You're too caught up in your books." I tried to explain my passion, my purpose, but I couldn't fight against the doubt that his words planted in my mind. Maybe I was too naive. Maybe he was right. I had built my world around something that wasn't practical, something that wouldn't pay the bills or get me ahead in life. Maybe I had been foolish to think that I could make a difference in a world that didn't care about my passion. Maybe I had been wrong to fight for something that felt right to me, even if no one else seemed to understand it. Then came the finances. Daniel insisted on taking over. "You're too busy with your students and your books," he said. "Let me handle this. I'm better at it. You don't need to worry about money." At first I resisted. It was my money, my savings, and I had worked hard for every penny. But he was persistent, persuasive. It was just a little bit of control, right? Just a little thing to help make life easier. I didn't need to worry about it. He would take care of everything. But soon, that control seeped into every corner of our life. I had no say in where the money went, how it was spent. He made all the decisions, and I was left with nothing but the feeling of being small, irrelevant. I started to second-guess everything. What did I know, really? Maybe he was better at these things than I was. Maybe I was too emotional, too unsteady. Maybe I needed someone to handle the practical things, while I focused on my impractical career. Maybe I should just trust him. He knew better, right? But that wasn't all. No. Daniel had another way of chipping away at me, one that I didn't see coming. He started isolating me from my friends. Slowly, carefully, he convinced me that the people I had known my whole life, people who had always been there for me, just didn't understand me the way he did. I think they just don't get you, he'd say with that calm, reassuring voice of his. They're always criticizing you, pushing you to be something you're not. They're not the ones who really care about you, Elena. I'm the one who's here for you. I'm the one who truly understands you. It didn't happen all at once. It was a whisper here, a suggestion there, and because I loved him, I listened. Because I trusted him, I let his words sink in. Slowly, I stopped calling my friends. I stopped meeting them for coffee or dinner. The excuses piled up. I'm busy with work. Daniel wants to spend time with me. I'll catch up with them next week. I didn't want to lose them, but I was losing myself, piece by piece, to someone who claimed to love me. I didn't even realize how far gone I was until one evening when I tried to call my best friend, Jess. I hadn't spoken to her in weeks, but when I dialed her number, I couldn't bring myself to say anything. What would I even say? That I hadn't spoken to her because Daniel told me I didn't need anyone else? That I had let someone else define my worth? When she didn't pick up, I felt this wave of guilt wash over me. I missed her. I missed the way she made me laugh, the way we would talk for hours about nothing and everything. But then I heard Daniel's voice in my head, like a soft whisper. You don't need her, Elena. You have me. That was when it hit me. I had allowed him to erase every connection I had outside of him. I had let him convince me that his world was the only world that mattered, and that everyone else was just an obstacle to our perfect life. He wasn't just isolating me physically. He was doing it emotionally. He had built this bubble around us, and I couldn't see beyond it anymore. But what hurt the most wasn't the isolation. It was the constant nagging feeling that I was losing something precious, that I was losing myself. I had once been so sure of who I was, so confident in my choices, but now I was questioning everything. Was I too sensitive? Was I overreacting? Maybe he was right. Maybe I wasn't cut out for the life I thought I wanted. Maybe I was too naive, too idealistic, too emotional. I looked at myself in the mirror, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. I used to be vibrant, confident, full of life, but now I just felt small. Why do I feel like I'm losing myself in this? I whispered to the reflection. Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm too sensitive. I didn't have the answers then. I didn't even know how to fight it, but I could feel it, this slow unraveling, this erosion of who I used to be. And the worst part? I didn't know how to stop it. Because in the world Daniel had created for me, I was just a shadow of myself. And I was starting to wonder if I would ever find the strength to break free. It wasn't just the arguments anymore. It wasn't just the isolation, the whispered doubts, or the subtle control. No, it was the moment he publicly humiliated me. That's when the walls inside me began to crack, and I realized that the person I had become was not the woman I wanted to be. And what's worse, I had stayed silent. The dinner party was supposed to be a celebration. Daniel had secured a major victory in one of his high-profile cases, and his colleagues wanted to congratulate him. The whole thing was extravagant: champagne, fine food, the kind of evening that felt so out of place in my modest life. But when Daniel smiled at me across the table, I didn't see a partner. I saw someone who had already started to tear away at the parts of me that made me whole. I had always been quiet in social settings, more comfortable with words on a page than words in a room. But that night, as I sipped my wine and tried to engage with his colleagues, I could feel his eyes on me. It wasn't the kind of gaze that made me feel loved or desired. It was calculating, almost possessive, like he was studying me, deciding where I might slip up next. And then It happened. The comment that I will never forget. The one that pierced through everything I had tried to ignore. "Elena's sweet," Daniel said, leaning back in his chair, a smug grin spreading across his face as the others laughed. "But she lives in her books. No idea how the real world works." The words hung in the air, so cold, so final that I couldn't breathe. His colleagues chuckled, the kind of chuckle that was just a little too loud, a little too forced. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the sting of humiliation spreading through my chest. They were looking at me, some with sympathy, some with amusement, but none with understanding. And all I could do was smile, that fake smile I had learned to wear for him over the years, the one that said everything was fine when nothing was. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run out of that room, out of that life, but I stayed. I stayed because I didn't know how to react. I stayed because for so long, I had been told that I wasn't strong enough to stand up for myself. And then the flood of thoughts hit me. The realization, the painful clarity that washed over me like a tidal wave. He wasn't just belittling me. He wasn't just making a passing remark. He was stripping me of who I was, of everything I had worked so hard to build. My books, my career, my dreams. They didn't matter to him. To him, I was nothing more than a naive woman living in a fantasy world. He had spent so much time telling me I was too idealistic, too sentimental, too removed from reality. But in that moment, it wasn't about my ideals anymore. It was about him erasing me. His words weren't just cruel, they were an assault on my soul. It was like he had reached into the deepest parts of me and tore away the foundation of my identity. I wasn't Elena, the professor, the woman who loved stories. I wasn't Elena, the person who had spent years immersing herself in literature to understand the world around her. No. I was Elena, the girl who didn't understand the real world, the one who was out of touch, the one who needed saving. And what hurt even more, I had let him do it. I had let him shape me, mold me, make me feel small. That night, after the party when Daniel had gone to bed, I found myself wandering through the house, my heart heavy with the weight of everything that had been said. It was late and I should have been asleep, but I couldn't. I couldn't escape the sharp sting of what had happened, the harsh words echoing in my mind. My feet led me to a drawer in the corner of our bedroom, a drawer that held my old journals that I hadn't opened in years. I picked up the first one, the pages yellowed with time. And as I read, something inside me snapped. I had written this entry years ago, before Daniel, before everything had changed. The words felt like a lifeline, a reminder of who I used to be before he had torn me apart. I'd rather be alone than small. The line hit me harder than anything Daniel had ever said. I could almost hear the voice of my younger self, the woman who hadn't been afraid to stand alone, the woman who hadn't allowed anyone to make her feel small. I had written those words in defiance, in strength. But now I was swallowed up by Daniel's world, by his criticisms, by the way he had twisted me into someone I barely recognized. I closed the journal, clutching it to my chest like a lifeline. I didn't know how I had gotten here, how I had allowed him to break me down so completely. But the truth was undeniable. I had become a shadow of myself, just a fragment of the woman I once was. And I hated it. I hated myself for letting it go this far. As I stood in the dark, holding that journal, I realized that something inside me had finally broken. It wasn't just the mockery, the public humiliation, the small comments that chipped away at me. No, it was the realization that I had lost myself in his control, that I had allowed him to strip away the pieces of me that made me who I was. I had spent so much time trying to make things work, trying to understand him, trying to please him, but I was drowning, and I couldn't breathe anymore. I wasn't just losing myself, I had already lost myself. But even in that moment of pain, a small, flickering spark of defiance began to grow inside me. I wasn't going to stay silent forever. I wasn't going to let him win. I had to find my voice again. I had to find the strength to be the woman I had once been. The woman who had written in her journal that she would rather be alone than small. But it was so hard. The fear of confrontation, the fear of what he might do if I stood up for myself, It was paralyzing. I had no idea how to begin, how to fight back against a person who had slowly become everything I'd feared. But in the depths of that fear, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let him take away my voice. Not anymore. The question was, when would I finally find the courage to say it out loud? For the longest time, I thought silence was a form of surrender. I believed that to stay silent was to give up, to let someone else have control over my thoughts, my voice, my life. But the truth was, silence is not always a defeat. Sometimes, silence is the loudest form of rebellion. I can't pinpoint the exact moment when I realized that. Maybe it was the first time Daniel criticized me for being distant, as though my every movement, every breath should be measured against his expectations. Or maybe it was when he began to nitpick the small things that once brought me comfort, things like my bookshelves, which had always been my refuge. When he said, "These bookshelves are a mess. You don't even organize your books. What are you trying to hide?" I was struck by something deeper than just irritation. It was as if he was scrutinizing not just my books, but the very essence of who I was. There was a time when I would have defended myself, tried to explain, maybe even apologize, but something inside me had shifted. This time, I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I didn't try to justify myself. I simply stood there, holding my breath, letting his words hang in the air like they had no power over me. I realized in that moment that I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need to defend my choices or my life to him or anyone else. My silence wasn't surrender, it was my choice. It was my way of taking back control. The next time he complained that I was distant, I gave him the same treatment: silence. He couldn't understand it. He didn't know what to do with it. The power of it was too much for him. His words became less sharp, less pointed, as though he was waiting for me to snap, to react in some way. But I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Every time he tried to provoke me, to drag me into an argument, I closed myself off even more. I looked at him, not with hatred or anger, but with something else. Something softer. Something more resolute. I had learned to wear my silence like a shield that protected me from the endless barrage of his criticisms and manipulations. I didn't need to argue anymore. My silence was my protest against everything he had tried to force upon me. It was my way of showing him that I wasn't going to play by his rules anymore, that I wasn't going to be the person he wanted me to be. In the beginning, it was unsettling. The silence between us stretched so long that it began to feel like a wall I couldn't scale. He would try to break it, of course. He always did. He would raise his voice, demand that I talk to him, that I stop being so cold. But each time, I refused. Each time, I let my silence grow louder, stronger, and I felt it, the shift inside me. For so long, I had allowed him to shape me, to mold me into the woman he wanted. I had doubted myself, doubted my worth. But now I was beginning to realize something powerful. The silence wasn't just a way to avoid confrontation. It was a way to protect the woman I had almost lost, the woman I wanted to find again. I started to understand something important in those moments of quiet. Silence, when used on my own terms, was a tool. It was a weapon. It was my rebellion, my stand against everything Daniel had tried to impose on me. I began to see it as my strength, a strength I hadn't recognized before. Every time I chose not to speak, every time I decided not to react, I felt a little bit freer, a little bit more in control. The noise of his demands, his criticisms, his manipulations, none of it mattered anymore. I didn't need to explain myself anymore. My silence was my answer. It wasn't a lack of words. It was a refusal to participate in a conversation I hadn't agreed to. The more I used silence as my shield, the more I realized how much power it gave me. I wasn't weak for being silent. I wasn't submitting. I was standing my ground. But the truth was, as much as I felt liberated in those moments, there was still a part of me that was afraid. I was afraid of what he might do next, of what might happen if my silence pushed him too far. He had always been the one in control, and now, with every word I didn't say, with every time I didn't respond to his provocations, I was shifting the balance of power. And I didn't know if I was ready for that. I didn't know if I was ready for the consequences of taking back my own voice. But as the days went on, I realized that my silence wasn't just an act of resistance against Daniel. It was an act of resistance against myself. It was me fighting the parts of me that had been silenced for so long. It was me reclaiming the woman I had been before I met him. The woman who had the strength to stand alone. The woman who didn't need to explain herself to anyone. It felt like an awakening, and even though I didn't have the courage to speak just yet, I knew that one day I would find my voice again. The silence was just the beginning. Silence isn't weakness, I told myself quietly, watching Daniel's frustration grow as he tried to draw me out. It's my strength, and one day it'll be enough to break free. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be enough forever. There would come a day when silence could no longer protect me. And when that day came, I would have to be ready. Ready to face him, ready to face myself, and ready to speak the words I had held back for so long. At first, Daniel didn't seem to mind the silence. In fact, he seemed almost relieved by it. It was as though he'd gotten what he wanted. Peace, quiet, no more arguments, no more resistance. For the first time in months, I could see him relax. His shoulders were less tense. He no longer had to raise his voice or try to overpower me. It seemed like a victory. His victory. He would talk to me, and when I didn't answer, he'd simply nod, as if the lack of conversation was a sign of my compliance, a sign that everything was fine, but I knew better. And I could feel it. The silence was louder than any of his words could ever be. For a while, I thought it might be enough, just retreating into this quiet place where I didn't have to face the harshness of his critiques or the manipulation that had slowly eaten away at me. For a while, the silence felt like a shield, a protective barrier between me and the person who had tried to break me. I was no longer giving him the satisfaction of an argument, and that, in itself, felt like a small victory. I had stopped explaining myself, stopped defending every word I said, stopped justifying every thought that passed through my mind. I had become the silent version of myself that was, in a way, freer than I had ever been. But then it started to change. At first, he didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he didn't want to notice. He would ask me questions that used to demand a response, questions that used to bring out the anxious, apologetic side of me, but now they just hung in the air, unanswered. "What's wrong, Elena? You've been distant lately." The words were simple, the tone casual, almost like a faint echo of concern, but his eyes, the way they searched mine, waiting for an answer that wasn't coming, told a different story. He was unsettled. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened when he spoke, the way his eyes flickered nervously when I didn't respond. At first, he attributed it to stress. "You're just tired," he'd say with a forced smile, as if trying to convince himself more than me. But the truth was slowly creeping in, and I could see it in the way his questions became sharper, more desperate. "You're really not gonna talk to me, not even a little?" His voice would catch, just for a second, but it was enough for me to notice. The calm exterior he had once worn was starting to crack, and as much as I tried to hide it, I couldn't help but feel the weight of his discomfort. It was strange, watching him squirm, watching him struggle to reach me when I had always been the one to reach out to him. I had been the one to accommodate his needs, to shrink myself to fit into his world. But now I was the one who stood apart, watching him from the outside. I had become a mirror, reflecting back at him nothing but his own confusion. There was no anger, no defiance in my silence, only emptiness. It was a mirror that reflected nothing, and it unsettled him in ways he didn't understand. He tried harder to make me engage. "Are you angry with me? Did I do something wrong?" The more he pushed, the more I withdrew. I didn't have to say anything for him to feel the truth. I was done. I had mentally left, even though my body remained. In that room, in that house, I wasn't the woman he had molded anymore. I wasn't the woman who would smile politely and pretend that everything was okay. It wasn't a decision I had made consciously. It wasn't like one day I woke up and realized I was ready to leave. But looking back, it was clear that I had already left. I had stopped fighting for the relationship, stopped fighting for his approval, stopped fighting for something that was never mine to begin with. The silence had taken on a life of its own. I wasn't afraid of what might happen if I stayed silent anymore. The fear had already been replaced with something else, something deeper, something stronger. I had been afraid for so long, afraid to lose him, afraid of being alone, afraid that if I stood up for myself, I would lose everything. But now, standing in the silence, I saw it for what it really was. I had already lost. The woman I had once been was no longer there, and the person I had become in this relationship was a shadow of someone who had never been given the chance to truly live. One evening, as I sat in the living room, Daniel tried once again to talk to me, his voice growing more strained. "Elena," he began, his tone softer now. "I know you're not okay. I can tell. We need to talk about this, please." But I said nothing. I didn't need to. His desperation was louder than any words I could have spoken. He had realized somewhere along the way that his power over me was slipping, and the more he tried to grasp it, the more it slipped from his fingers. "I don't have to speak anymore," I thought quietly to myself, watching him struggle. He's already realized the truth. He had realized that he couldn't control me anymore, couldn't manipulate me the way he had done before. The more he pushed, the more he pulled me away. I wasn't just physically distant. I was emotionally and mentally miles away from him, a place he could never reach, no matter how hard he tried. And that, more than anything, was what terrified him. For the first time in our relationship, I could see the cracks in his confidence. He wasn't the strong, unshakable man I had once admired. He was the one floundering now, struggling to maintain control over a situation that was slipping through his hands. And in that moment, I realized how much power I truly had. Not because I was shouting or fighting back, but because I wasn't giving him the satisfaction of doing either. I wasn't participating in his game anymore. And that in itself was my rebellion. Silence wasn't just a void, it was my statement. My way of saying that I didn't need to explain myself to him, that I didn't need to fit into the box he had built for me. My silence was my refusal to be who he wanted me to be. It was my final act of resistance. And as I watched him squirm, I knew that, for the first time in a long time, I was free. It wasn't the loud crashing of a door slamming or a dramatic exit. It wasn't a scene from some movie where the hero storms out, shouting defiance and fury. No, this was quieter, much quieter. And in its silence, it was more powerful than anything I had ever done before. Daniel had left early that morning for a meeting, one of his court appearances, I suppose. I had been waiting for this moment, although I hadn't known I was waiting for it until it arrived. The house was still, empty, the silence heavier now than it had ever been. It felt like a waiting room, a threshold I had reached, and I knew without a doubt that it was the last time I would step foot inside it. I hadn't planned this moment down to the details, but the more I thought about it, the more the plan felt right. There was no need for a confrontation, no need for the words I knew would fall on deaf ears. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said. No words that would change anything, no final argument that would lead to some kind of resolution. I had already said everything I needed to say through my silence. And now I was going to show him that silence could be louder than anything else. I moved through the house slowly, deliberately, as if I were walking through a dream. My fingers brushed lightly over the things I had once thought I couldn't live without. The photographs on the mantel, the small trinkets we had collected over the years. Everything felt so heavy now, so tainted by the weight of what had been. But I didn't stop. I didn't dwell on the memories. There was no time for that. My eyes landed on the engagement ring he had given me. It was beautiful, an elegant diamond, simple and timeless, just like he had wanted it. It had once been a symbol of everything I thought I wanted, a promise, a future. But now, it was just a reminder of the cage he had tried to trap me in. It had become a symbol of everything I was walking away from, and I knew I couldn't take it with me. I placed the ring on the kitchen counter, right in the center, where he would see it as soon as he walked in. It would be the last thing he would find before he realized that I was truly gone. Next, I grabbed a small piece of paper and wrote the words I had found in an old journal. A quote from my favorite novel, a line I had read so many times but had never truly understood until now. Some silences are answers. I folded the note neatly and placed it next to the ring. It was all I needed to say. It was a final answer, a refusal to keep explaining, a declaration that I was done living in a world where my worth was determined by someone else's expectations. As I stood there in the kitchen, looking at the ring and the note, I felt this strange calm wash over me. It was as if everything had come to an end without any need for grand gestures or tearful goodbyes. It was just over. I had already made my decision the moment I had chosen to stay silent. This was the final act, the one that would sever the last of the ties that held me to him. I turned and walked toward the door, each step more certain than the last. As I reached the threshold, I paused and took one last look around the house. The place where I had once dreamed of a life together, where I had hoped for something real. But now, it was just a house, a building, nothing more. I stepped outside, the cool air hitting my face like a slap. But it didn't feel cold. It felt like freedom. Like the first breath I had taken in years, the first moment where I didn't have to shrink myself down to fit into someone else's world. It wasn't just his world anymore. It was mine. I watched the door close behind me, its soft click signaling the end of a chapter I had once thought would be my forever. But as I stood there on the porch, my hand gripping the railing, I felt a sense of finality. I was no longer part of that world. And more importantly, I wasn't going to let him be the one who defined who I was anymore. I wasn't just leaving him, I was leaving the version of me that he had tried to control. The woman who had allowed herself to be small, to be invisible, to be less than what she had always been meant to be. There was fear, of course, a quiet, lingering fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of being alone, fear of the future and what it would hold without him in it. But it was different this time. It wasn't the paralyzing fear that had kept me trapped for so long. It was the kind of fear you feel when you know that taking a step into the unknown is the only way forward. I didn't know what was coming next. I didn't know where I was going or how I would rebuild the pieces of my life that had been shattered. But I knew one thing for certain. I was free. I was no longer bound by his rules, no longer defined by his love or his control. And that was worth everything. I started walking away from the house, my steps steady, my heart a little lighter than it had been in a long time. The road ahead wasn't clear, but it was mine to walk, and that, more than anything, made all the difference. Because now, for the first time in years, I was no longer afraid of what would happen if I left. I was afraid of what would happen if I stayed. A year had passed since I left. A year of silence, a year of freedom, a year of healing. And in that time, I had become someone else. Someone whole again. Someone unrecognizable to the woman I had been when I had lived under Daniel's shadow. My life had transformed in ways I never thought possible. I found my voice again, the one I had almost lost, buried beneath layers of self-doubt and fear. I no longer apologized for existing. I no longer bent to the weight of someone else's expectations. And for the first time, I felt like I was truly living. But even as I moved forward, I could still feel the echoes of the past, like whispers on the wind, faint but persistent. And I knew, deep down, that Daniel hadn't been able to escape them. It wasn't hard to see the cracks in his world. He had tried to move on, of course, he had to, at least outwardly. He threw himself deeper into his work, into the cases that he had once claimed were his passion, but now there was something different about him. A subtle desperation, a hollow edge to his smile, a flicker of something unspoken in his eyes. I had no desire to see him, but I knew in some strange, quiet way that I was still a ghost in his life. It wasn't just the stories I heard through the grapevine, how he had struggled at work, how his relationships had crumbled, how he couldn't seem to focus the way he once did. It was the way I saw him when I accidentally ran into him one day, in the midst of my own rebirth. I had been walking down the street when I spotted him, his back to me, head down, deep in conversation with someone. He didn't see me, but I saw him. And for the first time, I noticed how different he looked. He had aged in a way I hadn't expected, the weight of something heavy sitting on his shoulders. His once confident posture now seemed stiff, almost strained, like he was holding himself up with sheer willpower. And when he finally turned to face the person he was talking to, I saw it in his eyes, the emptiness. It wasn't just the loss of me. It was the loss of himself, the man who had once thought he controlled everything, including me. It was like seeing a version of him that had been broken. By me, by us, by everything he had taken for granted. And even from a distance, I could feel his regret hanging in the air. The way he scanned the crowd, the way he rubbed the back of his neck as if trying to erase the weight of whatever was eating at him. It was a familiar sight. One I had once watched from a distance when he was frustrated with me, with us, with the idea of who I was supposed to be. But now I was the one he couldn't reach, the one he couldn't fix. The truth hit me all at once. He was haunted. Haunted by my absence, haunted by the woman I had become, the woman he had never truly known. The silence I had left in my wake was far louder than anything I could have ever said to him. It gnawed at him, it followed him wherever he went, and no matter how many people he surrounded himself with, it was always there, lurking just below the surface. But I wasn't there anymore. I wasn't the woman he had tried to shape, tried to control, tried to mold into his idea of who I should be. The woman who stood before him now, the woman who had moved on, rebuilt her life, and found strength in her silence, was someone he didn't recognize. And I didn't care to let him. I couldn't help but feel satisfaction as I watched him from afar. The man who had once dictated the terms of my life, who had tried to break me, was now a shell of himself. But that satisfaction was bittersweet. As much as I felt justified in my actions, as much as I had fought for my freedom, there was still a small, quiet part of me that understood the cost. The ghosts of our past still lingered in the corners of my mind. I still carried the scars, even if I didn't show them. And as much as I had reclaimed my own life, I couldn't escape the fact that some parts of me, parts of him, would always haunt me. The silence I had chosen was no longer just a form of rebellion. It had become my protection, my boundary, my way of holding on to the parts of myself I had almost lost. But in Daniel's world, silence was a prison. He couldn't understand it. He couldn't break through it. And that, more than anything, was what haunted him the most. I knew that his regret was real. I could see it in the way he moved, the way his eyes searched the crowd as though looking for something, someone, to fill the empty space I had left. But he wasn't looking for me anymore. He was looking for redemption. He was looking for something that could undo the damage he had caused, something that could bring back the woman he had controlled. But that woman was gone, and she wasn't coming back. I stood there, watching from the other side of the street, the distance between us now so much more than physical. He didn't know what he had lost. But I also didn't know how much of him I had ever truly had. The man I had loved, or thought I loved, was never the one I thought he was. And the man who stood before me now was a stranger, a shadow of the person I had tried so hard to fit into my life. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad. I was free. Free from him, free from the man I had once believed could love me. And now, watching him struggle, I understood something important. He wasn't haunted by me. He was haunted by the truth of who he really was. And that was a burden I didn't have to carry anymore. Maybe he finally sees the truth, I whispered to myself, a soft smile curling on my lips. But I'm no longer here to tell him the story. It had been a year since I walked away from everything I thought I had to be. A year of rediscovery, a year of fighting my way back to the woman I had once been, and then some. The quietness that had once enveloped me, that suffocating silence I had worn like a shroud, had finally given way to something louder. My voice, my words, my story. It stood on the stage, looking out at a sea of faces. Some familiar, many not, but each one there because of the words I had written. My debut novel, The Quiet Ones, had become a sensation. People were talking about it, reading it, relating to it in ways I hadn't expected. The book wasn't just about a woman's silence. It was about finding one's voice after it had been lost. about the pain and strength in reclaiming your life from someone who tried to steal it. It was my story, but it wasn't just mine. It was the story of so many others who had quietly suffered, who had silently broken free. The applause as I finished my reading was overwhelming, but it felt natural. Right. This was what I was meant to do. This was who I had been all along, a woman with a voice, a woman who could speak and be heard. And yet, as I stepped down from the stage signing copies of my book for eager fans, I felt a presence in the crowd, a familiar, suffocating presence. I didn't need to look to know who it was. I had seen the way he had arrived earlier, trying to blend in, but his eyes searching for me, for any sign of the woman he once knew. And when I finally looked up, I saw him standing there. Daniel, time had done its work on him. He looked different, worn, tired, a far cry from the confident, assertive man who had once stood at the center of my world. His eyes were bloodshot, his face thinner, but they still held that sharp, predatory look, like he was searching for something in me. Maybe a way back into my life, or maybe just a way to understand what had happened to the woman who had once been so dependent on him. I didn't flinch. I didn't feel the rush of anger or the pull of old pain. I simply continued signing the books, my face an impassive mask. There was no recognition, no connection in the way I looked at him. To me, he was just another person in the crowd, a stranger. He was no longer the man who had controlled me, no longer the man who had tried to diminish me. He was nothing now, nothing but a memory of someone I had once allowed to be a part of my life. As I signed the last book for a fan, Daniel took a step closer, and I could feel his gaze on me, heavy with all the unspoken things he had never said. He opened his mouth, but I didn't wait for him to speak. I knew what he was going to say, the same words he always said when he wanted something from me: apology, justification, regret. But I didn't need to hear it. I have nothing to say to him anymore, I thought to myself, my pen still moving across the page as if he were invisible. He wasn't worth the silence. I didn't turn to face him. I didn't acknowledge him in any way. The truth was that I had already said everything I needed to say to him. Not with words, but with actions. My silence had been my greatest act of rebellion, and now it had become my greatest act of healing. I had learned to stand on my own, to let go of the need for his validation, to reclaim myself from the person who had once tried to erase me. As he stood there, watching me with that desperate look in his eyes, I could almost feel the weight of his regret pressing down on him. He had lost me, lost the version of me that had once been desperate for his approval, and now he had nothing but a ghost. A woman who was no longer his, a woman who had long since moved on. The twist was that, despite everything, despite how far I had come, Daniel still hadn't understood. He hadn't understood that the woman he had tried to mold, the woman he had tried to control, was gone forever. And in her place was a woman who no longer cared about his feelings, no longer needed him to define her. I saw him fidget, his shoulder stiffening, his hand twitching like he wanted to reach out but didn't know how. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The silence I had once used to protect myself had become my strength, my armor, my wall. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft, hesitant. Elena. But I didn't hear him. And even if I did, I had nothing left to say. Not to him. Not anymore. His words were hollow now, echoes of a past I had long since left behind. He had tried to break me, to control me, to define who I was. But the truth was that in trying to keep me small, he had only made me stronger. I stood there, facing the crowd, not him, my gaze steady and calm. I signed one last book for a fan, my hand no longer shaking, my heart no longer burdened. Daniel would never understand what he had lost, and maybe, in a way, that was the greatest victory of all. He wasn't worth the silence, and I wasn't his anymore. The true lesson here: never allow anyone to define you or limit your potential. Your voice, your power, and your life are yours to shape. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to silence the noise around you to truly hear your own voice? What did that moment of personal liberation look like for you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like this video if you believe in the power of reclaiming your life. Let's keep this conversation going because your voice matters here.